Spirit obtains this actuality here because the extremes of which it is the unity are also directly determined as being actualities on their own account. Their unity is broken up into two rigid, unyielding sides, each of which is for the other an actual object excluded from it. Consequently, the unity appears as a middle term, which is excluded and distinct from the separated actual existence of the sides. It has, therefore, itself as an actual objective existence, distinct from its sides, and has reality for them, that is something that exists. The spiritual substance enters as such into existence only when it is gained for its two sides, self-consciousnesses, which know this pure self as an actual existence having immediate validity, and in knowing this are also immediately aware that they are such actual existences only through the mediation of their self-alienation. Through that pure self, the moments of substance are so far purified as to be the self-knowing category, and thus to be moments of spirit. Through this mediation, spirit comes to exist qua spirit as a reality. It is thus the middle term which presupposes those extremes and is created by their existence. But equally, it is the spiritual whole issuing forth between them, which sunders itself into them, and only by means of this contact creates each into the whole in terms of its own principle. The fact that both extremes are already implicitly reduced to moments and set apart produces their unity. And this is the process which brings both into a unity, interchanges their determinations, and unites them in each extreme. This mediation thus posits the notion of each of the two extremes in its actuality, or makes what each is in itself into its spirit. Paragraph 509 is pretty densely metaphysical and you might say methodological on Hegel's part. So there's a good bit here for us to unpack, particularly just in terms of the language that he's using and what is happening here. Remember back to the previous paragraph, 508, where a lot of what Hegel had to say was in terms of language, and you want to look ahead to what is going on in paragraph 511 and a little bit later, where Hegel's going to return once again to language or linguistic phenomena. And keep in mind that what we're talking about here really is the interplay between two poles, and Hegel's going to be talking here about what's connecting them, what's mediating them, what is providing them with a certain kind of unity, but it's not a unity that collapses all of them into the same thing. Rather, what we're talking about here is a dynamic unity. So what does Hegel say in this text? He says, spirit obtains this actuality, and that actuality is really one of the core ideas running throughout this section. Things exist as actuality, as having a worldly presence. This is part of why Hegel is so focused on human history. Ideas matter insofar as they take shape through history in determinate forms, concrete ways of life, commitments that people make, and then see where they go. So he says, spirit obtains this actuality here at this point because the extremes, what are the extremes? The end points, the parts that are being viewed as what's really going on, these extremes, he says, are, of which it is the unity, spirit is the unity, are directly determined as being actualities on their own account. So not just actualities for somebody else, actualities on their own account. Now, I want to pause here for just a second. Think back to one of the points that Hegel was making earlier on in this section, and also in several other sections, where you've got this sort of two extremes. What are the extremes, by the way? I don't have them here on the board. We're talking essentially about state power and the noble consciousness. And spirit is somehow mediating the two of them. Now, the noble consciousness is, you could say, for itself. It is actual, it is a real person, or persons, or a class of persons, the nobles, and it exists. It has worldly presence, and it understands itself as such. It experiences itself as such. What about state power? State power is there to be recognized by everybody involved. Is state power conscious of itself as state power? At this point in the dialectic, Hegel is saying, yes, it is recognizing itself as an actuality in its own right. Both of them also recognize each other as actualities, other actualities that they're related to. And there's something that is unifying them, which is Hegel is calling spirit here, right? So he says their unity, the spirit, is broken up into two rigid, unyielding sides, each of which is for the other an actual object excluded from it. Have we seen this dynamic before? Yes, we indeed have. Both of them are misrecognizing what is going on in this situation. Neither of them is fully conscious of the fact that they are connected together by this unity, by a middle term. Each of them views the other as something that is not it, something that is excluding it. So state power on the one side, the noble consciousness on the other side, they exist for themselves, also in themselves, and in relation to the other, but the other by opposition. This is a strange way to talk at this point because, as we know, the noble consciousness is the noble consciousness precisely by identifying itself with the state power, by, you might say, willfully subordinating itself, sacrificing its own self. But as we've seen, that's not all there is to the story. So Hegel goes on and he says, the unity appears as a middle term. The unity is spirit, mind, consciousness in its full sense. Not possessed either by the state or by the noble consciousness, but something a third, over and above them. He says this is excluded and distinct from the separated actual existence of the sides. Now that is really interesting, isn't it, to say that? It is not only the case that these are excluding each other, but they're also excluding this third term. Something new is entering into the process. And it's entering into the process as an actuality, as yet another actuality. As I put here, actuality two. Also actuality, we might say. So we have yes and no, or 1 and 0, and then another, something else. So he goes on, and he says, here we go. It has, therefore, an actual objective existence distinct from its sides, and has reality for them. That is, it is something that exists. How might we conceptualize this for ourselves? Both of the sides are aware that the opposition of themselves to the other extreme is not all there is in the picture. Can they make sense of this for themselves? We're going to see this talked about at the very end of this paragraph, aren't we? So he goes on and he says, the spiritual substance enters into existence only when it has gained for its two sides self-consciousnesses which know this pure self as an actual existence. So now these two sides are no longer just extremes that exist for consciousness here, and it's not just that there's self-consciousness on this side and state power on this side. Both of these have become now self-consciousnesses. And we have to explore, well, how can state power itself be a self-consciousness? And that's not answered here in this paragraph, but it will be in the paragraphs yet to come. So, coming back to this, he says, The spiritual substance enters into existence when it's gained for its two sides self-consciousnesses which know this pure self as an actual existence having immediate validity. So they grasp this unity, which they are not, but which you could say is them, and unites them together and brings them into something greater than themselves. He goes on and he says, just to finish this sentence, in knowing this are also immediately aware that they are such actual existences only through the mediation of their self-alienation. Both sides are being, or becoming rather, conscious of the fact that there's something else involved here that they cannot encompass, something else that they cannot dominate. It's not just that they're missing out on what the other side is, so that, for example, the state power might look at the noble consciousness and perhaps even feel a sense of jealousy or envy towards it, or something similar maybe going on the part of the noble consciousness where it obeys the state power but thinks, maybe I could do this job better, and maybe they're not really getting me. But the third term is also, which is uniting them in a consciousness of their self-alienation. They're not only alienated from each other, they're also alienated from themselves. So we have a very complex picture here, don't we, in this discussion, in this paragraph. Now, that's not all there is going on. Hegel goes on and he says that it's through that pure self, the moments of the substance are so far purified as to be the self-knowing category. We see Hegel over and over again talking in ethical terms about the category, about what it is that's going to encompass everything, right? So the self-knowing category, and thus to be moments of spirit. Through this mediation, spirit comes to exist qua spirit as reality. This is really a very important point, a crux in this development. Spirit, this is the phenomenology of spirit, right? The phenomenology of Geist, of mind, of spirit, of what is driving history, what is trying to come to full consciousness of itself. It has to do so through actualizing itself, not just through an Aristotelian mind thinking itself, but through actualizing itself in the world in relation to these other actualities. That is part of what Hegel means by the term spirit. That's part of why I think in English, neither spirit nor mind is really a satisfactory translation of Geist in this case, right? Because we're leaving one thing out or we're leaving another thing out. Hegel's idealism is a pragmatic engagement with reality, at least at points like this in the dialectic. So he goes on. And he says, it's the middle term which presupposes those extremes and is created by their existence. So in a way, spirit at this point in time is coming into existence, becoming something worldly, becoming something manifest that people can see as spirit because of the interplay between these extremes, their lack of identity, the slippage between them, right? So spirit arises through that. Spirit becomes actual and existent through that. He says that it's equally the spiritual whole issuing forth between them. It provides them with a unity. Now, remember that Hegel has just finished telling us about language. I'd mentioned in the previous paragraph's commentary that we're not getting a general theory of language here, but spirit is working through language to provide this, you might say, milieu in which these things can play themselves out. So he goes on and he says that it's the spiritual whole issuing forth between them, which sunders itself into them, and only by means of this contact creates each into the whole in terms of its own principle. It recognizes what each is, you could say. So he says, both of these extremes are reduced to moments and set apart. This is what produces their unity. Hegel's going to close here by talking about the notion, the concept, the Begriff, right? He says this mediation posits, sets forth the notion of each of the two extremes in its actuality, or makes what each is in itself into its spirit. So what is it? This is, again, a key Hegelian point. What is it to have a notion as opposed to having a mere understanding or a concept not in the Hegelian sense, but in the previous senses of the term? It's to recognize how all of these are connected together. And that is what spirit is doing. So we've got this very, abstract, very metaphysical passage. That's what's going on here. And now we're going to be able to turn our attention back to some things that we can actually tie in, with actualities. It's one thing to talk about actuality in the abstract. It's another thing to actually see an actuality as such. The two extremes, the state power and the noble consciousness, are split up by the latter. The state power into the abstract universal, which is obeyed, and into the self-centered will, which, however, does not yet conform to the universal. And the noble consciousness into the obedience rendered by the existence which is not self-centered, or the intrinsic being of self-respect and honor, and into the still unsurrendered being for itself, the will that still reserves its independence. The two moments into which both sides are purified, and which therefore are moments of language, are the abstract universal, called the general good, and the pure self, which in serving the state renounced its own many and various interests. Both are essentially the same, for pure self is just the abstract universal, and consequently their unity is expressed as their middle term. But the self is at first actual only in consciousness. In the one extreme, while the in itself is actual only in the state power, the other extreme. What consciousness lacks is the actual transference to it of the state power, not merely in the form of honor, and what is lacking in the state power is that it should be obeyed, not merely as the so-called general good, but as will, or that it should endow the self with the power of decision. The unity of the notion in which the state power still stands and into which consciousness has been purified becomes actual in this process of mediation, the simple existence of which as middle term is language. However, the sides of the unity are not yet selves which exist as selves, for the state power has yet to be energized into a self. This language is therefore not yet spirit that completely knows and expresses itself. Paragraph 510 now introduces a bit more concreteness into the discussion from the previous paragraph, which was a little abstract, and now we're actually getting some things that we can identify here: the state power, the noble consciousness. Remember that we have as the mediating term for both of these spirit, and we have the notion or concept, the Begriff, bringing them together. And Hegel is charting out for us the process of its development. So he tells us that these two extremes, right, are being split up into their own twos. They're being bifurcated within. Remember that he said that they were self-alienated. Not only are they alienated from each other and unified through spirit, but they were also, you might say, split, broken asunder within themselves. And here, Hegel is going to tell us about how two of the sides are, within these, are really sort of working behind the scenes. And then there's what we could call the public face, right? And so the state power is broken up into the abstract universal, which, as he says, is what demands and gets obedience, and then a self-centered will. What is this self-centered will? He's going to talk about this a bit more in the next paragraphs, but we might think here about, who's actually in charge, who calls the shots within the government that represents state power. And so we have, a sort of relation here within. And then on the side of the noble consciousness, as we remember back several paragraphs before, it wasn't all just sacrifice and obedience and thereby getting self-respect for itself and honor. There was also another side, the unsurrendered being for itself, as he called it, right? The noble holds something back. And insofar as the noble holds something back, they're not completely noble. But if they didn't hold something back, they really wouldn't be a person. In a sense, they would become their own abstraction, wouldn't they? This is a tension within this entire dynamic. And likewise over here, if the government is all just entirely abstract, universal, the government existing for everybody, the totality, and there's nobody who actually has a corner office or who gets to sleep in their office and wake up and have breakfast brought to them so they can start conducting affairs of state, you don't really have state power. So there has to be this, you might say, behind the scenes aspect or dimension to it in order for it to work. And what we see most of the time, what people focus upon is the relation between these two sides of the noble consciousness and state power, the state and its servitors who are elevated by serving. And so Hegel is going to tell us here that after these are split up, right? He says, these two moments into which both sides are purified and which therefore are moments of language are the abstract universal, called the general good, and the pure self, which in serving the state renounced its own many and various interests. So this is what we talk about, the general good and the pure self. And there's an exchange going on here as well between these, an interchange. By giving obedience to the general good, to the abstract universal, to the state, the noble individual gets back honor from the state. Also, to some degree, participates, you might say, in its power. You become a minister or a general or whatever. The one who does the dirty work, perhaps, even. So he goes on and he says, this is happening in language, right? He says, both are essentially the same. Both of these are essentially the same. Why? He says the pure self is just the abstract universal, and consequently their unity is expressed as their middle term. This is where spirit is tying things together, right? To bring us back to what was talked about in the last paragraph. So he says, the self is at first actual only in consciousness in the one extreme, while the in itself is actual only in the state power, the other extreme. So this isn't completely worked out yet. These two sides are fusing together in a certain way, but they're not completely there. So he says, what consciousness lacks is the actual transference to it of the state power, not merely in the form of honor. See, the possession of something from the state power is always contingent. You could have your position removed. The state power can exile you, can push you aside. So it's not yet within the possession of the noble, is it? It's actually in the possession of the self-centered will, but we're not talking about that quite yet, are we? So he goes on and he says, consciousness lacks the actual transference of the state power, not merely in the form of honor, and what is lacking in the state power is that it should be obeyed, not merely as the so-called general good, but as will. That it should endow the self with the power of decision. So there's kind of a things not completely adding up here going on. The general good draws things to it. It tells you what you ought to do. But what actually makes decisions, what actually determines is the will. That's not yet represented here. Hegel goes on, and he says, the unity of the notion in which the state power still stands and into which consciousness has been purified becomes actual in this process of mediation. What is mediation? This is a term that we throw around a lot in the Hegelian system and in the development of consciousness here in the dialectic of the Phenomenology of Spirit, isn't it? What is mediation? We could go back to the preface and look at that. It's really having something else that is required, that has a role, that exerts itself within there. It can be a middle term, or these can be mediating each other. There can be self-mediation. But the point is, one way of thinking about mediation is nothing is ever as simple as it looks. There's always some influx. There's always some contribution by something else. So he goes on and he says, this process of mediation, the simple existence of which as middle term is language. So once again, we come back to language. Hegel has talked about this as being within the realm of language. And now the mediation that's going to take place, you might say, bringing these things together, this is going to have to be brought into language, and this is going to have to be brought into language. How is that going to happen? It's not all happening here. This is going to happen in subsequent paragraphs. So he brings this to a close by saying, the sides of the unity are not yet selves which exist as selves. State power has yet to be energized into a self. It still has to have this self-centered will having its role. This language, he says, is therefore not yet spirit that completely knows and expresses itself. And yet, here's what he's not saying. It is spirit. This is the process by which spirit comes to know itself, and language plays a role.